Addiction is a medical condition. And we have to be conscious of looking at how it affects everything. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that there is a framework that has evolved now around addictions that helps us to understand how pernicious they are. And the things that seem to accelerate it are access, easy to access. Porn, easy to access. Food, well, you got to eat food. So they've always got that choice. So it's about availability. And one of the things when I started 50 years ago and I started working with adolescents in the street, I was amazed at the number of parents who did not have any idea about the drug use of their adolescent kids. I was stunned at it. Today, parents would be stunned by what's happening with children and adolescents in terms of their access to sexuality on the internet, that they don't know that's going on. The second thing is toxic stress, trauma, fear. Fear is the chief chemist of the brain, changes everything. And toxic stress, or what we call trauma, causes hormonal interaction that changes the genes faster. So I'm involved with a study, 23% of them were born with the DNA gene of dopamine having a problem. But as adults, every person in the study that I'm involved with has damaged dopamine genes, all 100%. So what happened between the 23% and the 100%? Toxic stress. They got at some point were very stressed out and hurt. And the other thing, supernormal stimulus. In other words, one of the problems in sexuality, it's like crystal meth in a way. We are built to deal with one woman at a time. Now, I have been married and I have been divorced. I had a very successful marriage for 20 years, a woman who died in 2010. And I'm now married to a widow. So I've had some experience of living with women, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And one of my experiences is to really show up in a marriage and a relationship requires your total attention. However, and that's how we're built. However, on the internet, you can be engaged 6 conversations at the same time. You can look at 50 naked women at the same time. And it's happening to women as well as men because women are rapidly becoming porn users. And we are seeing that in both our men's unit and our women's unit at the Meadows. The reality is Pornhub reports that 35% of their users are now women. And so the fact is that it's changing, and the supernormal stimulus grabs it, and it's changing our sexuality. The people who put that together, the article on genetics and the impulsivity, compulsivity, and the addiction medical condition, are Ducci and Goldman are their names. They encompass drugs, food, sex, video gaming, and gambling. One of the things that they point out, this is very important, is substance abuse alone costs our culture $484 billion a year. We only spend $131 billion on diabetes and $171 billion on cancer. It's already our biggest problem, our biggest public health problem. And they emphasize the critical role of genes and interactive enzymes. If you're really interested in understanding this whole story, I highly recommend Lynn McTaggart's The Field, in which she talks about all the physics involved in which has helped us to understand how the brain functions. Our job is to knowing this, what does that mean that we got to do? So now we have to sort out what we as clinicians need to know and what recovering people need to know and how we can help them. So the way that I would like to start thinking about that is to go to diagnostic criteria, the kinds of things we need to do. I wrote an article for the Journal of Addictive Medicine looking at the diagnostic criteria of sex addiction. And in that, one of the things I found is lots of other people who worked on that. There's the article, I made a chart, which you now see in front of you. And in there is all the diagnostic criteria that we use typically for gambling or substance abuse, pretty well documented in about 10 different studies having occurred as present in the population. And I think it's important to understand that sex addiction co-occurs often with, like, and Caron Foundation published a study that sex addiction, about 20% of their admissions. So when you come to the opiate overdose question, and again, I'll put another example of an article on that, coming out of treatment, part of the problem is they haven't treated the whole thing. They just did part of it, and then they relapse because they are involved in the other type of addiction. And so one of the things that we did is we wrote an article in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and talking about basically a reward gene polymorphism and how the gene structure changes. And it has some, a list of specific things that emerge in what we call dopamine insufficiency syndrome. The capacity to process dopamine is impaired, is often accompanied by attention deficit disorder. It's a maladaptive response to adversity. In other words, they're trying to solve a problem and they don't do it well. We learn that addictions interact with one another. For example, for a long time, we noticed that cocaine addicts would look at porn and and be 8-10-hour binges, and they wouldn't want to ejaculate. And what I thought it was about was, this is one of my many opinions that have had to change. I thought it was because it's masturbating that long that they hurt themselves because they talked about the pain of it. What truly was the problem is that the ability to ejaculate, the ability to be sexual has become impaired. And so they now have a sexual disorder because they can't get it, they are impotent, and in order to achieve a orgasm, they have to go for a long period of time. So there's also the fact that Gucci and Goldman talk about as this soup is being made in the brain by trauma and it's changing the genes, that mental health issues also appear. For example, when I was trained, bipolar and borderline and psychopathy, various psychopathologies was literally something you were born with. Well, yes, some are born with it, but also people can develop that based on trauma. And so they develop personality disorders, and some of them are really hazardous to themselves. So they all work together in an identified pattern as a syndrome. And we say in the article, and what we're working on now is genotyping studies. Already have linked gene polymorphic associations with alcohol and drug addictions and obesity, and we anticipate that future genotyping studies of sex addicts will provide evidence for polymorphic associations with specific clustering of sexual typologies based on clinical instruments. So I'm going to show you an example of what we're doing right now, and I'm going to talk to you about one of the instruments that we use is the MMPI. And like many things in psychometrics, you may understand that there's also an effort because of new statistical techniques such as latent probability, that what we're able is to see things. It's like we're looking through a different lens. It's not just a microscope. It's like an electron microscope. And so when we would measure do a cluster analysis, like say exhibitionism, there are lots of ways you can exhibit yourself. It forms a scale though, because an exhibitionist likes to do that in numbers of different ways, and it shows up on the testing. Well, that would be like a mountain. What higher order scales do is look at a mountain range. Across behaviors, there are characteristics, and I'm briefly going to review, not because I expect you to be able to master this quickly, because it takes some time to do, but I just want to point out the areas. And this is an example of a patient with higher order scales that he's high on. In other words, the red line indicates that the level of preoccupation around this particular problem is relatively high. There are 7 problems. And the first is a kind of a trading. The drug and sex trade, drug for sex, a swinging, all stuff where you just, it's very relativistic. There's an exchange somewhere. And that's a very common one for addicts to have. Networking for anonymous sex, very interesting, where there's kind of a chase involved. I get patients that as soon as they get a higher order scale and networking, I ask them, well, when did you stop meeting the women that you were going to be with? And he said, how did you know about that? And I said, because there comes a stage when you get a score like this that you make the date with her, and that's the you don't even have to have sex with her. That's the high. That's the moment, and you go for that moment. And then once you got a date, then you go on to the next woman. Swinging in public anonymous sex, lots of ways that occurs across sexual behaviors. And then isolated self-stimulation, which stands for literally being in a different universe, lots of different behaviors, but it has a characteristic of withdrawal from society, feelings of depression and feelings of lack of self-efficacy, and the ability, they prefer a second universe to the one they actually live in, simply. Sexualized attachment is when, that's like the fatal attraction kind of a notion. You target someone, and it also has a hunting characteristic, and it's part of the challenge. There's also exploitation of the vulnerable, and then there's finally there's pain and role playing, which can happen in a wide variety of different contexts sexually. Point of seriously, you got these 7 overarching themes that we see in sexual behavior today that we can measure. Now, the reason I'm bringing up all this is the MMPI RF. And there's a lot of terms. You might not be familiar with the RF. It's relatively new. But what I put in front of you is you will notice that the second item on the left-hand column is literally what they call demoralization. And what I want you to notice about it is, and demoralization is really about the fact that we have terms that we use like depression, and it kind of becomes too wide. And you need to slice it into pieces to become more precise and accurate about what's going on. And demoralization is basically hopelessness. And if you look at that line across all of our characteristics we just talked about, The demoralization score, hopelessness, is in every category. When I saw that, I asked my colleagues, well, does that happen anyplace else? And they said, yeah, alcoholism, compulsive gambling. And what I realized is what I'm seeing is where you end up as an addict is if you can't stop and you're doing something you really don't want to do, you become demoralized. And what I'm trying to raise as an issue is that it is an implicit part of the addictive process that depression is a co-occurring disorder much more than we ever thought. And the other thing we found, we're starting to assemble some of our data now, we found that ADHD was also very much part of the issue, the inability to focus. And the reason that becomes important is that there's a process that works in kids. Half of my patients start looking at porn at the age of 7, even though they're in their 40s and 50s now. I want you to think about that. They started in the early 90s. And so the fact of the matter is that they're doing this and not doing well in school, so their parents get a consultation and somebody says, he can't get his homework done, he's got ADHD. We'll put him on Adderall, which is a stimulant. And what kids learn is that Adderall and porn is a step up. And then they graduate to other forms of stimulants that they can buy and get at school, or maybe even find in their parents' medicine cabinet. And then they're off to the races because now they're using, because one of the best ones is crystal meth. And so it grows. And then they get into the opiates and they get into heroin, and you have overdoses. And at 20, where did this addiction come from? It started with gaming, which teaches you a learning system in your brain to look at the next conquest, the next win, moves into sexuality, moves into the chemical addictions. And at the same time, we see that other things are appearing in our kids today. There's been a lot of debate about putting sex addiction in the DSM-5. I don't want to go into all the politics of it, but I would say that we are making progress. Sexual compulsivity is now in the ICD-11, which is exactly what happened with gambling. And gambling went into sexual compulsivity in the ICD-11 and then shifted into the addictive behavior section of the DSM. And looks like we're following the same route. The problem is with our children. Looking at an iPad, it looks like they're just having a great time learning and what have you. But we found that the fact of the matter is, the very first major study of this appeared in Pediatrics, the journal. And the idea being is that what happened as they got stimulated by sex, they started looking for more and more of it. They're not telling their parents. And one of the things that we see is by the end of high school, we see a lot of erectile dysfunction, like I mentioned. And we also are now done, thanks to our European friends, a lot of fMRIs, and starting, because porn is a great thing to be able to study with an fMRI, because you can deliver the stimulation right to the brain and measure it. And became very clear that porn addiction is very real. And one of the things that we started seeing is in the same parts that crystal meth affects, what have you. And one of the things that is important is to understand that, in fact, the brain starts to change. So 4 hours of porn, for example, literally starts to restructure the brain. And the ways that you see it is gray matter declines, the striatum is affected, where you have feelings, emotional regulation, memory, what have you. And there's an ability to start affecting the frontal lobes and how they make decisions. So a very bad idea looks good because the reward cycle is so powerful, it distorts the thinking of the kid as they're going along. And what I want to also point out to you is that in our culture, obesity is in the same deal. 20% of our adolescents, 15-year-old kids, are obese. About 1/3 of our grade school kids are. 1/3 of our adults are obese. And one of the things I did when I started getting on, and I'm just going to flash some articles in front of you, but the common highlights are the same circuit of reward and pleasure, a sophisticated neural system regulates the food intake and energy expenditure. Food intake is controlled by a set of cognitive and emotional factors involving the reward. From the understanding the mechanisms, it's possible to seek new therapeutic approaches. And that the dopamine receptors are very much involved in this. So there's a chart appearing on your screen that compares food and drugs in terms of looking at it as an addiction context. A BMI of 30 is where they use kind of leaves the compulsive world and gets into the addictive world. And one of the things that we know is that the more obese people are, the more depressed they become. So it's like all of these things are starting to interact. And so what we've done when we talk to our patients is we talk about substances, we talk about processes, we talk about relationships, but there's also issues of emotional regulation and affect can be changed. Alice Miller and the Drama of the Gifted Child, which is a book all of us know pretty well, she talked about the addictive dependence on feelings of pain. In other words, that at the core, a driver of the addictive process is that some trauma and some pain is pushing that. Now that's going to change things, but what I want to first show you is a brief cartoon prepared by the Palix Foundation and Alberta Family Wellness. And it illustrates the issue that's of how brains are damaged, and what has to happen is on it. So please give this a watch. It's very effective with patients. It's also free to use for you if you want to get access to it. The Canadians are very willing to share it with us. So please watch.
Exhibit troubling signs: addiction, illness, depression, social disorder. Yet others thrive. Why have some brains developed the ability to cope in harsh conditions while others struggle? It is one of nature's great secrets.
Hi. Hello? This is amazing. But I just need to clarify a few things. This great secret? It's actually science. Severe adversity isn't good for any brain, but it is true that some brains do better than others in the face of significant challenges.
Oh, scientist. Yes, I agree. This is a great secret of science.
Great, yes, but not a secret. Let me explain. We're born with brains, but our brains change as we grow. They develop based on experiences we have, and different brains respond to experiences in different ways. Okay, thanks. I'll let you get back to it.
Indeed. Some brains show muscularity and strong attitude, while others...
Sorry, we scientists use the word resilience. Some brains are more resilient than others.
Yes, resilience.
Resilience?
Resilience. Revenge of a cortex.
Resilience is a result of the interplay between genes and life experiences. It's a brain's ability to maintain good functioning under adversity.
Resilience makes us invincible.
Nothing makes us invincible. What resilience does is to give less leverage to negative factors in our lives and tip the balance in favor of positive outcomes.
Resilience, fate's legendary prize.
Whoa, no! Some people are born with more resilience than others, but resilience can also be built over time. It's a big project involving parents, caregivers, teachers,
Karaoke comrades,
soccer coaches, counselors,
pastry chefs, associate producers, even millennials. Like a boy makes times ago.
Yeah. In fact, we scientists believe strong brain architecture is the foundation for resilience. And, oh, look over there.
Oh, yes. A young brain returns after months of isolation and adversity. No words can describe what this poor brain has suffered.
There are words that describe it. We scientists call it toxic stress.
Toxic stress lies in
No, that's not. No. Stress happens inside the body. It's the fight or flight system kicking in. But if stress hormones are elevated too high and for too long, it can have negative effects on the brain and body.
stress. Nasty poison.
Not all stress, just toxic stress. With the right supports, we can make severe stress tolerable, which means it won't do lasting damage. Stress can even be positive because it helps us to learn problem-solving and coping skills, which leads us back to resilience.
Perhaps this brain is resilience best.
No, it isn't. Let me explain. Remember when I talked about giving less leverage to negative experiences and tipping the scale in a positive direction? Well, here's a little something I've been working on. It's a really amazing metaphor. Here goes. I call it the resilience scale.
Resilience scales. Protective armor plates that
Shiny. But no. The resilience scale helps us understand why some brains are more resilient than others.
the resilience scale sends out invisible resilience rays that
It's really just a scale. See? It's a beam being held up by a fulcrum.
full of grub.
Jeez, no! A fulcrum. You know, like high school Never mind. Let me just clean this up. See, negative experiences add weight to one end of the beam, and positive factors add weight to the other end. Ideally, we want the scale to tip toward the positive side and lead towards positive life outcomes.
The brain's future literally hangs in the balance.
The position of the fulcrum can be understood as our original capacity for resilience. It's something like our genetic starting position. Remember the young brain that was struggling to survive? Look, it started life with the fulcrum off-center, giving more leverage to negative experiences. Serious stuff, like abuse, neglect, and chaotic environments. That means positive factors like responsive relationships, safe environments, and learning opportunities had less leverage. Over time, the negative load shifted the fulcrum even farther in a negative direction.
Tragedy.
Not at all. Right now, this brain is experiencing poor health. But with help, the scale can be tipped toward more positive outcomes. The first thing we can do is to stop negative experiences from stacking up. Then, we can add more positive factors, loading up the positive side of the scale. And we're not done. We can work to shift the fulcrum in a way that favors positive outcomes.
The fulcrums, an amazing instant fix-it button.
No, it's a process. It involves many supportive people and plenty of time. Remember? This brain is still young, so adult brains can work with it to relieve toxic stress and teach coping skills. In early childhood, these efforts can push the fulcrum a considerable distance.
Child, filled with fascination and fulcrum's flexibility.
Sort of, but there are other sensitive developmental periods that are windows of opportunity, like adolescence. And even if this brain doesn't get help until adulthood, change is still possible. It will take more support, and the change will be less dramatic. But any fulcrum can be moved to make positive outcomes more achievable.
The bad experiences disappear.
I'm afraid not. It's hard to undo the effects of past negative experiences, and it takes time. but we can eventually relieve the burden of those negative experiences. Our little brain can get the help it needs to adapt, recover, and enjoy good health and wellness.
And everyone, everywhere can become more resilient for eternity.
And why not? With the right support, everyone everywhere can become more resilient.
I'm so glad I saved humanity. It's been a majestic experience.
Yeah, me too. Well done.
I know it seems cute, but it also has a very important lesson, and it's about how do you get that seesaw to work for you. And remember in the cartoon they talked about moving the fulcrum, and you'll notice within the fulcrum is the DNA part of it. And some of that can't be fixed now. But the real trick is to build resilience. And when you build resilience, you start to move the fulcrum. This is really important for us in all of our disciplines to understand that resilience is key. So to put it in 12-step language, you've often heard the phrase, I don't care how long you've been in the program, you're the same distance from the ditch. That means it would be very easy to go back to where you were. I think it's true and not true. What's true about it is if you don't do anything more and really work on your recovery, you'll end up back in the ditch. However, if you really build a resilience program and you really build that into your life, it's about confronting adversity. And that is what life is. As I age, I've had to face harder things as I grow older. It's the nature of the beast. The fact is that the whole universe is built on adversity. So, for example, if you go out into space, empty space is not empty, it's full of energy. And on a galactic level, there is always collisions and catastrophes and what have you, that happens all over the universe. It's part of the way the universe is made. I look out at the forest outside my window here. Looks peaceful, tranquil, green leaves, oxygen. You look at that, gives you feelings of peace. What I know about that forest? The competition for air, sunlight, fierce. And some plants make it, some trees don't. That's the way it's built. That lake out there looks calm, serene. We enjoy it. But underneath that surface, there's a constant war going on. Within your body, your white blood cells are actively on the hunt, and you want them to be. The point I'm trying to make is life is filled with adversity, and we die. And you have to have that resilience and teach that resilience. Now, there's some feelings, going back to the addictive dependence on feelings, if they overwhelm you and you don't have resilience to deal with them, that's a problem. So one of the things I want to bring to your attention, I love the Star Wars analogies because, in effect, they're built on quantum physics. Star Wars was written from a quantum physics point of view, and Lucas incorporated all the learnings that he had to persevere to get that film built and the way that he built it. And it's been an extraordinary success, but also teaches very valuable lessons. Yoda, there are 59 Yoda sayings, and one of my favorites are, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And when you look at this dark side, careful you must be, for the dark side looks back.